In 1901, John D. Rockefeller was the richest man in American history. His fortune from Standard Oil was estimated at $900 million, equivalent to $27 billion today, though economists argue his true wealth, measured as a share of the American economy, would equal $400 billion in modern terms. That year, he was 62 years old. He'd already retired from active management of Standard Oil. He'd already given away tens of millions to charity, and he was about to build a mansion that almost no one outside his family would ever see. The estate was called Kykuit, a Dutch word meaning lookout. It sat on 3,400 acres in the Pocantico hills of Westchester County, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. The mansion itself cost $2 million to build, roughly $60 million in today's money. The gardens cost another $1 million. The sculpture collection would eventually be worth hundreds of millions more. But here's what makes Kykuit different from every other Gilded Age mansion. It still belongs to the family that built it. Andrew Carnegie's Fifth Avenue Palace was demolished in 1936. Gone. Replaced by apartment buildings. Nothing remains. The Vanderbilt mansions became museums or were torn down. The Astor estates were sold and subdivided. The Frick mansion became a public museum. Every great industrial fortune of the Gilded Age eventually lost its palace, except the Rockefellers. Today, 111 years after Kykuit was completed, the Rockefeller family still controls it. Yes, it was donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1991, but the donation came with conditions. The family retained significant influence. Tours are limited. Access is restricted. Large portions of the estate remain completely off limits to the public. Even in giving it away, the Rockefellers kept it. How did one family manage to hold on to their mansion when every other dynasty lost theirs? What made the Rockefellers different? And why did John D. Rockefeller build an estate that was deliberately hidden from the world? The answer lies in understanding what Kykuit actually was. It wasn't just a mansion, it was a fortress, a declaration of permanent dynasty, a physical embodiment of the idea that wealth, if properly protected, can last forever. Carnegie built his mansion on Fifth Avenue where everyone could see it, where newspapers could photograph it, where the public could judge it. He wrote essays about the moral duties of wealth. He believed the rich owed society an explanation. Rockefeller built 30 miles north of New York City, in a location almost no one could reach. He surrounded the property with stone walls and iron gates. He hired guards to keep people out. He never explained himself. He never justified his fortune. He simply built and then closed the gates. And when he died in 1937 at age 97, he didn't leave the estate to a widow who might be forced to sell it. He left it to a son who was wealthier than he was, who had established trusts and foundations that ensured the family fortune would never run out. Who understood that Kykuit wasn't just a house. It was the physical proof that the Rockefeller dynasty would never end. Carnegie's mansion lasted 33 years. Kykuit has lasted 111 years, and counting. Carnegie gave away his fortune and lost his palace. Rockefeller gave away even more and kept his. This is the story of Kykuit, the oil palace no one was supposed to see, the mansion that survived when all others fell, and the dynasty that understood something Carnegie never did, that in America, generosity without control is suicide, but control disguised as generosity is immortality. To understand how the Rockefellers achieved this, we need to go back to 1839, to a small town in upstate New York, where a boy was born to a con man and a devout mother. A boy who would grow up to control 90% of American oil. A boy who would become richer than kings. A boy who would build Kykuit. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839 in Richford, New York. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a con man. Literally. William sold fake cancer cures, called himself Dr. Livingston, and disappeared for months at a time, leaving his wife Eliza to raise 6 children alone on whatever money she could scrape together. The family moved constantly. Richford to Moravia to Owego to Oswego. By the time John was 7, they'd lived in 4 different towns. By the time he was 14, they'd settled in Cleveland, Ohio. Eliza Rockefeller was devoutly Baptist. She taught her children that work was prayer, that waste was sin, and that every penny saved was a penny God approved of. John absorbed these lessons completely. At age 7, he raised turkeys and sold them to neighbors. At age 12, he loaned a local farmer $50 at 7% interest and collected $3.50 when the note came due. He recorded the transaction in a ledger. He would keep ledgers for the rest of his life. In 1855, at age 16, Rockefeller took his first job as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a Cleveland commission merchant firm. His salary was 50 cents per day. He worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week. He recorded every transaction in perfect script. He never made an error. Within 3 months, his employers raised his pay to $25 per month. He saved everything. By 1858, at age 19, he'd accumulated $800. He used it to form a partnership with Morris Clark, a fellow produce merchant. The firm, Clark and Rockefeller, bought and sold grain, meat, and farm produce. In their first year, they grossed $450,000. Rockefeller's share was $4,000, 8 times his annual bookkeeper's salary. The Civil War began in 1861. Farm commodity prices exploded. Armies needed to be fed. Clark and Rockefeller profited enormously. By 1863, Rockefeller was earning $17,000 per year. He was 24 years old. And then he discovered oil. In 1859, Edwin Drake had struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. It was the first commercial oil well in American history. The Pennsylvania oil boom began immediately. Speculators flooded into the region. Derricks sprouted across the countryside. Oil sold for $20 per barrel in 1859. By 1861, it had crashed to 10 cents per barrel due to oversupply. The industry was chaos. Drillers had no idea how much oil existed underground. Wells would produce for months, then suddenly run dry. Prices swung wildly. Fortunes were made and lost in weeks. It was a gambler's game. Rockefeller hated gambling. He studied the oil business carefully and reached a conclusion. Drilling was too risky. The real money wasn't in finding oil. It was in refining it. In 1863, he and Morris Clark invested $4,000 in a Cleveland oil refinery operated by a chemist named Samuel Andrews. The refinery turned crude oil into kerosene, which could be burned in lamps. Kerosene was replacing whale oil as America's primary lighting source. Demand was enormous and growing. The refinery was profitable immediately. By 1865, Rockefeller bought out Clark's share for $72,500 and became the majority owner. The firm was renamed Rockefeller and Andrews. That same year, Rockefeller married Laura Spellman, the daughter of a wealthy Cleveland merchant. Her father gave them a house as a wedding gift. Rockefeller was 26 years old. He owned the largest oil refinery in Cleveland, and he was just getting started. Between 1865 and 1870, Rockefeller expanded aggressively. He built a second refinery, then a third. He bought barrel-making companies to supply his refineries. He bought warehouses to store his kerosene. He bought tank cars to ship it. Every piece of the supply chain he brought under his control. In 1870, he incorporated Standard Oil Company of Ohio with capital of $1 million. Rockefeller owned 27% of the shares. His brother William owned 13%. Samuel Andrews owned 11%. Henry Flagler, who would later build his own mansion empire in Florida, owned 8%. Stephen Harkness, a silent investor, owned 14%. Standard Oil refined 1,500 barrels of crude oil per day. It was the largest refinery operation in the United States, but Rockefeller wasn't satisfied with being the largest. He wanted to be the only one. In 1872, Rockefeller formed the South Improvement Company, a secret alliance between Standard Oil and the major railroads. The deal was simple. Standard Oil would guarantee the railroads a fixed volume of oil shipments. In exchange, the railroads would give Standard Oil massive rebates, discounts of up to 50% on shipping costs. But the deal went further. The railroads would also give Standard Oil rebates on its competitors' shipments. If a rival refinery shipped oil on the railroad, Standard Oil would receive a percentage of what that competitor paid. This meant Rockefeller's competitors were literally funding Standard Oil's advantage. Every barrel they shipped made Rockefeller richer and themselves weaker. When the deal became public, the oil regions exploded in fury. Drillers in Pennsylvania rioted. They refused to sell crude oil to Standard Oil. They burned Rockefeller in effigy. The South Improvement Company was forced to dissolve under political pressure. But Rockefeller had learned the lesson. Control the railroads, and you control the industry. Over the next 10 years, he negotiated private rebate deals with every major railroad. He never formed a public alliance again. The deals were secret. Handshake agreements, verbal understandings, no paperwork, no evidence. With his shipping cost advantage, Rockefeller could undercut any competitor. He would offer to buy rival refineries at fair prices. If they refused, he would slash his kerosene prices below cost until the competitor went bankrupt. Then he would buy their assets at auction for pennies on the dollar. Between 1872 and 1879, Standard Oil acquired or destroyed 90% of the oil refineries in the United States. In Cleveland alone, Rockefeller bought out 22 of 26 competitors. The 4 that refused were driven out of business within 2 years. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining. It owned 20,000 oil wells. It operated 4,000 miles of pipeline. It employed 100,000 workers. And it was making John D. Rockefeller unfathomably rich. In 1882, Rockefeller reorganized Standard Oil as a trust, a new legal structure that allowed him to control dozens of subsidiary companies under a single management umbrella. The Standard Oil Trust held stock in 41 companies across multiple states. Rockefeller and 8 trustees controlled it all. The trust was brilliantly designed to evade state regulations. If Ohio passed a law restricting Standard Oil's activities, Rockefeller simply moved operations to New Jersey. If New Jersey cracked down, he shifted to Delaware. The trust was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pin down. Critics called it a monopoly. Rockefeller called it efficiency. The day of combination is here to stay, he said. Individualism has gone, never to return. Standard Oil's profits were staggering. In 1879, the company earned $3.5 million. By 1882, annual profits exceeded $10 million. By 1888, they reached $20 million. By 1899, Standard Oil earned $45 million in a single year. Rockefeller's personal share ranged between 25% and 35%, depending on the year. In 1900, his income from Standard Oil alone was approximately $15 million, equivalent to $550 million today. And that was just 1 year. He'd been earning similar amounts for 2 decades. By 1913, when Kykuit was completed, John D. Rockefeller's net worth was estimated at $900 million, roughly $27 billion in today's money. But economists who study historical wealth argue this vastly understates his true fortune. Standard Oil controlled 91% of American oil production at its peak. Adjusted for economic share of GDP, Rockefeller's wealth would equal approximately $400 billion today. He was the richest man in American history, richer than Carnegie, richer than Vanderbilt, richer than anyone who came before or after, with the possible exception of John Jacob Astor at his peak. But there was a cost, the same cost Carnegie had paid. Standard Oil workers labored in dangerous refineries where explosions and fires were routine. Between 1885 and 1900, at least 127 workers died in Standard Oil refinery accidents. This number is incomplete. Many accidents went unreported, especially injuries to immigrant workers who had no legal recourse. Workers earned $1.50 to $2.50 per day, depending on their role. Skilled workers might earn $3.50. They worked 10 to 12-hour shifts 6 days per week. There were no pensions, no injury compensation, no job security. If you were hurt on the job, you were fired. If you complained, you were blacklisted. Rockefeller's response to worker complaints was the same as Carnegie's had been. Competition is a sin. He believed that ruthless efficiency benefited everyone in the long run. Lower kerosene prices helped poor families afford lighting. Standard Oil's economies of scale made oil cheaper for all Americans. The workers who died in refinery fires were, in Rockefeller's view, casualties of progress, regrettable perhaps, but necessary. By 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court had had enough. In Standard Oil Company of New Jersey v. United States, the court ruled that Standard Oil violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered the trust to be dissolved into 34 separate companies. Rockefeller's response was to laugh. Because he owned shares in all 34 companies, the breakup didn't destroy his wealth, it multiplied it. As the separated companies competed and grew, their stock values soared. Rockefeller became even richer after the breakup than before. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, Marathon, Conoco, all of them traced their origins to Standard Oil. All of them made Rockefeller's heirs wealthier with each passing decade. And through it all, Rockefeller was building Kykuit. He had started purchasing land in the Pocantico Hills of Westchester County, New York in 1893. By 1913, he owned 3,400 acres overlooking the Hudson River. And on the highest point of that land, he built a mansion that almost no one would ever see. Before Kykuit, there were the refineries, massive industrial complexes that turned crude oil into kerosene, gasoline, lubricants, and dozens of other products. These were the factories that built Rockefeller's fortune. And like Carnegie's Homestead Steel Works, they came at a human cost. Let's start with the largest, the Bayonne refinery in New Jersey. Standard Oil purchased the Bayonne site in 1877. It sat on 1,200 acres along the Kilvan-Cull waterway, directly across from Staten Island. The location was strategic. Oil could arrive by ship or pipeline. Refined products could be loaded onto barges and sent to New York City, the largest kerosene market in America. By 1900, the Bayonne refinery employed 4,500 workers. It operated 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The facility contained 65 separate refining units called stills. Each still processed crude oil through a heating and condensation process that separated it into different products based on boiling points. The lightest fraction became gasoline, the middle fraction became kerosene, the heaviest fraction became lubricating oil and asphalt. Nothing was wasted. Even the residue left at the bottom of the stills was sold as fuel oil. This was Rockefeller's genius, total efficiency. Every barrel of crude oil was wrung dry. Every byproduct found a market. Standard Oil made money on products that other refineries threw away. But the process was dangerous. Crude oil had to be heated to temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit. The stills were essentially giant pressure cookers filled with flammable liquid. If a still cracked or a valve failed, the result was an explosion followed by an inferno. Between 1880 and 1900, at least 43 workers died in fires at the Bayonne refinery. This is the documented number from newspaper accounts and company records. The actual number was almost certainly higher. Immigrant workers, Poles, Italians, Irish, often died without their deaths being officially recorded. A typical accident. In March 1887, a still ruptured on the night shift. Burning oil sprayed across the work floor. 5 men were caught in the blast. 3 died immediately. 2 survived, but were so severely burned they died within days. The Newark Daily Advertiser reported the incident in 4 sentences. Standard Oil paid no compensation to the families. The workers had no life insurance. Their widows received nothing. Standard Oil's position was that industrial accidents were inevitable. The company was not responsible for acts of God or worker carelessness. If men chose dangerous work, they accepted the risks. Rockefeller himself never visited Bayonne. He never toured the refineries. He never spoke to the workers. He managed Standard Oil from a distance, through reports and ledgers and profit statements. The refineries were simply numbers on a page. Inputs and outputs, costs and revenues. Let's talk about those costs. A skilled refinery worker at Bayonne earned $2.50 per day in 1900. That's $75 per month, approximately $900 per year. In modern currency, that's roughly $33,000 per year. An unskilled laborer earned $1.50 per day, $45 per month, $540 per year. About $20,000 in today's money. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts were standard. In summer, temperatures inside the refinery exceeded 120 degrees. In winter, workers labored in unheated buildings with oil-slicked floors and no protective equipment. Chemical burns were common. Respiratory diseases were epidemic. Men coughed up black mucus from breathing oil vapors for years. There were no breaks. If you needed water, you drank from a communal bucket that sat near the stills. If you needed the bathroom, you held it until your shift ended. If you slowed down, a foreman would fire you on the spot. There were always more men waiting at the gates. Standard Oil's employment policy was simple. If you don't like the work, leave. There were hundreds of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island every day who would gladly take your place. By 1900, Standard Oil operated 6 major refineries: Bayonne in New Jersey, Cleveland in Ohio, Whiting in Indiana, Richmond in California, Baton Rouge in Louisiana, and Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. Combined, these facilities employed approximately 15,000 workers. Each refinery followed the same pattern: 12-hour shifts, 6-day weeks, minimal safety equipment, no injury compensation, no job security. The Cleveland refinery, where Rockefeller had started his empire, employed 2,800 workers by 1900. It sat on the Cuyahoga River, which the refinery used as a dumping ground for chemical waste. Oil residues, sulfuric acid, caustic soda, everything went into the river. By 1890, the Cuyahoga was so polluted, it occasionally caught fire when oil slicks on the surface ignited. Standard Oil paid no fines. There were no environmental regulations. Rivers were considered free disposal systems. The Whiting refinery in Indiana was even larger than Bayonne. Built in 1889 on the shores of Lake Michigan, it employed 5,200 workers by 1910. It refined oil from newly discovered fields in Ohio and Indiana. The facility covered 1,400 acres and contained 78 stills. The Whiting workforce was heavily immigrant, Polish, Hungarian, Czech, men who spoke little English and had no understanding of American labor law. Standard Oil preferred these workers because they were less likely to organize or complain. In 1902, a group of Whiting workers attempted to form a union. They demanded higher wages, shorter hours, and basic safety equipment. Standard Oil's response was immediate. The entire organizing committee, 17 men, was fired. Their names were circulated to other refineries. They were blacklisted from the industry. The union effort collapsed. No other Whiting workers dared to organize for the next 20 years. This was Standard Oil's labor strategy: crush resistance before it spreads, pay just enough to prevent open rebellion, fire anyone who questions the system, keep workers desperate and replaceable. Rockefeller believed this approach was morally justified. In his view, Standard Oil provided jobs to thousands who would otherwise have nothing. The company paid competitive wages, not generous but comparable to other industrial employers. Workers were free to leave if they found better opportunities elsewhere. That, they rarely did, said more about the state of American labor markets than about Standard Oil's generosity. There were no better opportunities. Every factory, every refinery, every steel mill operated the same way. Standard Oil wasn't uniquely cruel. It was typically cruel. But Standard Oil's monopoly gave Rockefeller a unique advantage. He could suppress wages across the entire industry. Because he controlled 90% of refining, he essentially set the market rate for refinery workers. If workers at Bayonne demanded higher pay, Rockefeller could point to Cleveland, where men worked for less. If Cleveland workers complained, he could point to Whiting. No individual refinery could raise wages without making itself uncompetitive. And because Standard Oil owned all the refineries, there was no competition. Wages stayed flat for decades, even as Standard Oil's profits soared. Between 1882 and 1906, Standard Oil's annual profits increased from $10 million to $83 million, an 830% increase. Worker wages increased by approximately 15% over the same period, barely keeping pace with inflation. Where did those profits go? Some were reinvested in new refineries and pipelines. Some were distributed to shareholders, and a considerable portion went to John D. Rockefeller personally. By 1900, Rockefeller's annual income from Standard Oil exceeded $15 million. That's $550 million in modern currency per year, every year. He used that money to buy art, to fund universities, to build churches, and to construct Kykuit. Now let's talk about what Standard Oil actually did inside those refineries. The refining process began when crude oil arrived by pipeline or ship. The oil was pumped into massive storage tanks, some holding up to 55,000 barrels. From there, it was piped to the stills. Each still was a vertical cylinder, typically 30 feet tall and 8 feet in diameter, made of riveted iron plates. The crude oil was pumped in from the bottom. A furnace beneath the still heated the oil to progressively higher temperatures. As the temperature rose, different components of the crude oil would vaporize. The vapors rose through a series of pipes and cooling chambers where they condensed back into liquid. The lightest vapors, gasoline, condensed first, then kerosene, then lubricating oils. The heavy residues stayed at the bottom. This process, called fractional distillation, was well understood by the 1880s. Standard Oil's innovation wasn't the technology, it was the scale. A single still at Bayonne could process 500 barrels of crude oil per day. The refinery had 65 stills. That's 32,500 barrels per day. By 1910, Bayonne was processing over 50,000 barrels daily. The logistics were staggering. Crude oil had to arrive continuously. Refined products had to be packaged and shipped immediately. Any delay meant storage tanks overflowed. Any breakdown meant entire production lines shut down. Standard Oil managed this through military-style coordination. Shift schedules were planned weeks in advance. Maintenance was conducted on precise timetables. Workers were assigned to specific tasks and expected to perform them flawlessly, shift after shift, year after year. The human element was simply part of the machinery. If a worker was injured and couldn't perform his task, he was replaced immediately. There was no transition period, no training for the replacement. The new man was expected to figure it out or be fired. This system worked because the task was simple and repetitive. You didn't need to understand chemistry to shovel coal into a furnace or turn a valve when the foreman shouted. But the system also meant that when something went wrong, men died. In July 1900, a gasoline storage tank at the Cleveland refinery exploded. The cause was never determined. Possibly a spark from a worker's metal tool striking the tank, possibly static electricity. The explosion was heard 5 miles away. The fire burned for 11 hours. 6 workers died, 14 were injured. Standard Oil's official response: regrettable accident, company not liable, workers assumed risk. The families of the dead received no compensation. The injured workers who could no longer work were dismissed. Standard Oil paid for the funerals $50 per burial and considered the matter closed. John D. Rockefeller was informed of the accident by telegram. He was at his estate in Pocantico Hills at the time, overseeing construction of Kykuit. There is no record of his response. By 1910, Standard Oil had refined approximately 20 billion gallons of kerosene since its founding in 1870. It had employed an estimated 200,000 workers over that 40-year period, accounting for turnover. At least 127 of those workers died in documented refinery accidents. Thousands more were injured. The company's position remained unchanged. Industrial progress requires sacrifice. The benefits of cheap kerosene outweigh the costs. And the benefits were real. In 1865, before Standard Oil, kerosene cost 58 cents per gallon. By 1900, it cost 7 cents per gallon. Poor families who once spent a significant portion of their income on lighting could now afford it easily. Rockefeller pointed to this constantly. Standard Oil had democratized lighting. It had made life better for millions of Americans. Yes, workers died. Yes, rivers were polluted. But the net result was positive. This was the same logic Carnegie had used to justify Homestead. Progress requires casualties. The greater good justifies individual suffering. But there was a difference. Carnegie's workers had fought back. The Homestead strike became a symbol of labor resistance. However brutally, it was crushed. Standard Oil's workers never rebelled in the same way. There was no defining strike, no singular moment of resistance. Why? Because Standard Oil's monopoly was absolute. At Homestead, workers could imagine finding jobs at competing steel mills. At Standard Oil, there were no competitors. If you were fired, you were finished in the industry. The monopoly didn't just control prices and markets. It controlled lives. And it made John D. Rockefeller rich beyond measure. Rich enough to spend $2 million building a mansion. Rich enough to buy 3,400 acres of land. Rich enough to landscape gardens, commission sculptures, and import art from Europe. The oil that heated those stills came from the earth. The profits from that oil went to Rockefeller. And the mansion those profits built still stands today, overlooking the Hudson River, owned by the family that built it. Carnegie's palace was demolished because history judged it too tainted to preserve. Rockefeller's estate endured because the family controlled it completely. No one could force them to sell. No one could demand it be open to the public. No one could tear it down. That difference between Carnegie's public exposure and Rockefeller's private control is the reason Kykuit still exists, and it's the reason almost no one saw it for decades. The refineries built the fortune built the mansion, and the mansion was designed from the beginning to be hidden from the world that made it possible. In 1893, John D. Rockefeller began purchasing land in the Pocantico Hills, 30 miles north of New York City. The area was rural, heavily forested, and almost entirely undeveloped. There were no mansions, no estates, no wealthy families, just farms and small villages. This was deliberate. Rockefeller didn't want neighbors. He bought the first parcel, 75 acres, for $15,000. Then another 100 acres, then 200 more. He purchased farms, woodlots, and entire hillsides. By 1900, he owned 1,200 acres. By 1910, the Pocantico estate encompassed 3,400 acres, more than 5 square miles. The land cost approximately $800,000 total. In modern currency, that's roughly $27 million just for the property before any construction began. Why did Rockefeller choose this location? 3 reasons. First, distance from New York City. 30 miles was far enough to escape the noise, pollution, and crowds of Manhattan, but close enough to reach by carriage or automobile within 2 hours. Second, elevation. The highest point of the Pocantico property sat 520 feet above the Hudson River, offering sweeping views of the river valley, the Palisades cliffs across the water, and the distant hills of Connecticut. The Dutch settlers who had originally farmed the land called this high point Kykuit, lookout. Third, privacy. Rockefeller could buy enough surrounding land to ensure no one could build near him. He could control access completely. He could create a private world where the public could not intrude. This last point was critical. By the 1890s, Rockefeller was the most hated man in America. Newspaper cartoonists drew him as an octopus strangling the country. Ministers preached against him. Politicians campaigned on breaking up Standard Oil. Ida Tarbell's expose, The History of the Standard Oil Company, was being serialized in McClure's magazine, documenting Rockefeller's ruthless business tactics in devastating detail. Rockefeller's response was to retreat. He stopped giving interviews. He stopped appearing in public. He built a wall, not metaphorical but literal, around his property. Construction of Kykuit itself began in 1906. The architect was Chester Holmes Aldrich of the firm Delano and Aldrich. Aldrich had designed estates for other wealthy families and understood what the ultra-rich wanted: grandeur without ostentation, luxury without vulgarity. The style chosen was Georgian revival, symmetrical, formal, restrained. Unlike the French chateau that the Vanderbilts favored or the Gothic castles that other industrialists built, Kykuit would look like an English country house, dignified, classical, old money. The mansion itself was relatively modest by Gilded Age standards, 40 rooms, not 64 like Carnegie's palace, not 70 like the Breakers. 40 rooms was enough to house the family, accommodate guests, and provide workspace for Rockefeller's correspondence and business affairs. But modest is a relative term. The building footprint was 23,000 square feet. The basement alone contained 18,000 square feet of storage, mechanical rooms, and staff quarters. The total cost of construction was $2 million, equivalent to $60 million today. The exterior was Indiana limestone, pale grey and perfectly dressed. The roof was slate, imported from Vermont. The windows were double-hung sash with bronze hardware. Every detail was expensive, but nothing was flashy. The house looked like it had been there for 100 years. Not like it had just been built by oil money. Rockefeller insisted on this aesthetic. He despised the nouveau riche excess of families like the Vanderbilts. He wanted Kykuit to feel established, permanent, ancestral, even though his family had been poor farmers 2 generations earlier. The interior followed the same principle, quality over display. The main entrance opened into a central hall with a coffered ceiling and Tennessee marble floors. The walls were panelled in quarter-sawn oak. No gilding, no murals, no Tiffany glass, just wood and stone and carefully chosen proportions. To the left of the entrance hall was the music room. Rockefeller's wife Seti played piano, and he enjoyed listening to her. The room was designed for chamber music performances, intimate, not theatrical. It seated 30 guests comfortably. The ceiling was barrel vaulted. The acoustics were engineered by the same consultant who had worked on Carnegie Hall. To the right was the library, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves made of mahogany, a fireplace with a marble mantel imported from Italy, 2 reading chairs positioned by the windows overlooking the gardens. Rockefeller spent hours here reading, writing letters, and reviewing Standard Oil reports that were delivered to Kykuit weekly. The dining room was on the south side of the house. It could seat 18, though family dinners typically numbered 4 to 6. The table was English oak. The chairs were upholstered in leather. A sideboard held Chinese porcelain that Rockefeller had purchased during a trip to Asia in 1900. Upstairs, the bedrooms were surprisingly simple. Rockefeller's own bedroom was modest, a brass bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a single armchair. He believed luxury in sleeping quarters was wasteful. A bed should be comfortable, not palatial. His wife Seti had a larger suite with an adjoining sitting room, but it was still restrained by Gilded Age standards. No canopy bed, no silk wallpaper, just good furniture, good light, and good views of the Hudson River. The house had modern amenities, electricity, central heating, indoor plumbing, but they were integrated discreetly. Light switches were brass plates set flush with the walls. Radiators were hidden behind carved wooden screens. Bathrooms had marble floors and porcelain fixtures, but nothing ostentatious. Kykuit was completed in 1913, 7 years after construction began. The delay was partially due to a fire in 1907 that destroyed the partially built structure. Rockefeller ordered the entire mansion rebuilt from scratch with improved fireproofing. But the house was only part of the estate. The real masterpiece was the gardens. Rockefeller hired William Wells Bosworth, a landscape architect who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Bosworth designed a series of terraced gardens descending from the mansion toward the Hudson River. The design was inspired by Italian Renaissance villas, formal, geometric, structured. There were 4 main terraces, each approximately 200 feet wide and connected by stone staircases. The first terrace, directly behind the mansion, featured a reflecting pool with fountains. The second terrace had a sunken garden with seasonal flowers. The third terrace held a rose garden with over 1,000 bushes. The fourth terrace was a lawn bordered by trees that framed views of the river valley. The entire garden complex covered 12 acres and required constant maintenance. Rockefeller employed a team of 45 gardeners year-round. They worked 6 days a week, planting, pruning, weeding, and mowing. In summer, they worked from dawn until dusk. In winter, they maintained the greenhouses where tropical plants and flowers were cultivated for the mansion's interior. But Bosworth's most striking contribution was the sculpture collection. Rockefeller's son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., developed a passion for classical and modern sculpture. Between 1908 and 1935, he purchased more than 120 pieces for the Kykuit gardens, Greek and Roman antiquities, Renaissance bronzes, modern works by Aristide Maillol, Gaston Leches, and Pablo Picasso. The sculptures were placed throughout the gardens, at the end of pathways in alcoves beside fountains. Walking through Kykuit's grounds was like touring an outdoor museum. A marble Apollo stood at the entrance to the rose garden. A bronze Diana overlooked the reflecting pool. Abstract modernist pieces contrasted with classical nymphs and satyrs. This collection would grow over the decades. By the 1970s, when Nelson Rockefeller, John Jr. S. son, added his own acquisitions, Kykuit held one of the finest private sculpture collections in America. Works by Alexander Calder, Henry Moore, and Louise Nevelson populated the terraces. But in 1913, when Kykuit first opened, the gardens were still relatively sparse. The sculptures would come later. What mattered in 1913 was that Rockefeller had created exactly what he wanted: a private world, hidden from the public, protected from intrusion. The estate was surrounded by stone walls and iron gates. Guards were posted at every entrance. No one entered without explicit permission. No photographers were allowed, no journalists, no curiosity seekers. Kykuit was closed to the outside world. Rockefeller's staff at Kykuit numbered approximately 60 people at peak operation. This was actually larger than Carnegie's 30-person household staff, though Kykuit's grounds were far more extensive. The staff hierarchy was rigid. At the top was the estate manager, who oversaw all operations and reported directly to Rockefeller. The estate manager's salary was $3,000 per year, approximately $90,000 in modern currency. Below him were department heads: head gardener, head housekeeper, head chauffeur, head groundskeeper. Each earned between $1,200 and $2,000 annually. Then came the workers. Indoor staff included maids, cooks, footmen, and laundry workers. Outdoor staff included gardeners, groundskeepers, stable hands, and chauffeurs. Most earned between $400 and $800 per year, roughly $15,000 to $30,000 in today's money. The indoor staff lived on the third floor of the mansion in small bedrooms, typically 10 by 12 feet. Two maids shared a room. Footmen had individual rooms but shared a bathroom. They ate in the basement kitchen after the family had finished dining. The outdoor staff lived in separate buildings on the property, cottages and dormitories scattered across the estate. Married workers with families were given small houses. Single men lived in group quarters. The work schedule was demanding. Indoor staff worked from 6 a.m. until the family retired for the night, typically around 10 p.m. They had one day off per week, usually Sunday, though someone always remained on duty in case the family needed anything. Gardeners worked 6 days a week, 8 to 10 hours per day in summer, slightly less in winter. Groundskeepers worked year-round maintaining roads, fences, and the estate's infrastructure. All staff wore uniforms. Maids wore black dresses with white aprons. Footmen wore livery, dark coats with brass buttons. Gardeners wore work clothes but were required to change into clean uniforms if they needed to approach the main house. The rules were strict. Staff were forbidden to speak to the family unless spoken to first. They were not allowed to make eye contact with guests. They entered rooms silently, performed their tasks, and left without conversation. Rockefeller preferred invisibility. He wanted the estate to run perfectly without being aware of the labor that made it possible. Meals appeared at precise times. Flowers were always fresh. The lawns were always manicured. But the people who made this happen were expected to be ghosts. This was not unique to Rockefeller. Every Gilded Age estate operated this way. Servants were furniture. They existed to serve, not to be acknowledged. But there was a specific irony at Kykuit. Rockefeller had made his fortune by controlling labor costs at his refineries. He paid the minimum necessary wages. He crushed union organizing. He fired injured workers. He treated employees as interchangeable parts in a machine. And at Kykuit, he employed 60 people under the same philosophy. They were paid market wages, not generous but competitive. They were expected to work long hours without complaint. They were replaceable. The difference was that Kykuit staff lived in cleaner conditions, faced less physical danger, and weren't at risk of dying in refinery explosions. But the fundamental relationship was the same. Rockefeller provided employment, and workers were expected to be grateful for it. By 1913, Rockefeller was 74 years old. He had officially retired from Standard Oil in 1897, but continued to receive dividends from his shares. His annual income exceeded $20 million, roughly $600 million in modern currency. He spent his days at Kykuit playing golf on the private 9-hole course he'd built on the estate. He walked the gardens, he read, he answered letters. He managed his philanthropy, which by 1913 included founding the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial endowment of $100 million. He had given away approximately $175 million by this point, more than half his fortune. He would give away another $350 million before his death in 1937, making him one of the greatest philanthropists in American history. But Kykuit was not philanthropy. Kykuit was private. It was for the family, and it would remain in the family for the next century. Unlike Carnegie's mansion, which was sold to a developer and demolished within 30 years, Kykuit would pass from John D. Rockefeller to his son, to his grandsons, to his great-grandsons. The estate would expand, the gardens would grow. The sculpture collection would become world-famous. Kykuit would host presidents, diplomats, artists, and intellectuals. But it would never be truly public. Even when the family eventually allowed limited tours in the 1990s, access remained tightly controlled. You couldn't just visit Kykuit. You had to make reservations months in advance. You were assigned to a guided tour. You could only see the rooms and gardens the family permitted. This was Rockefeller's legacy, a mansion that survived not because history chose to preserve it, but because the family never let it go. Carnegie built on Fifth Avenue where the public could see. Rockefeller built in Pocantico Hills where no one could. Carnegie's mansion died with the Depression. Rockefeller's estate endured through wealth that never ended. The difference was control, total, absolute, multi-generational control. And that control began the moment Rockefeller chose the site, bought the land, and built walls around it. Kykuit was designed from the first architect's sketch to be untouchable. It worked. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937. He was 97 years old. The cause was arteriosclerosis. He died at his winter home in Ormond Beach, Florida, not at Kykuit. But Kykuit was where he was brought back to be buried, in the family cemetery on the estate grounds. His death made front-page news across America. The richest man in history was gone. His estate was valued at $26.40 million, roughly $550 million in today's currency. This sounds modest compared to his peak wealth of $900 million in 1913. But that's because he'd given away approximately $540 million to charity over his lifetime. The estate went to his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who had already been managing the family's affairs for 2 decades. And unlike Carnegie's widow, Louise, who struggled to maintain the mansion and eventually sold it, Jr. had no intention of ever letting Kykuit go. This is where the stories diverge completely. When Carnegie died in 1919, his wife Louise inherited a mansion she couldn't afford to maintain. The 1929 stock market crash destroyed her investments. By 1935, she was forced to sell the palace for a fraction of its value. It was demolished within a year. When John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, his son inherited not just Kykuit, but an ongoing fortune that generated millions in annual dividends. The 1934 breakup of Standard Oil had actually increased the family's wealth. Jr. owned shares in 34 separate oil companies, all of which were thriving. More importantly, Jr. had established trusts and foundations that ensured the Rockefeller wealth would continue indefinitely. The Rockefeller Foundation, founded in 1913 with $100 million, was generating returns. The family's real estate holdings, including Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, were producing steady income. The Rockefellers didn't just survive the Depression, they thrived during it. While other wealthy families were forced to sell estates and dismiss staff, the Rockefellers expanded Kykuit. Junior lived at Kykuit full-time after his father's death. He was 63 years old and had spent his entire adult life in his father's shadow. Now, finally, the estate was his. His first act was to expand the sculpture collection. Between 1935 and 1950, Junior purchased over 70 major works for the gardens. Classical pieces, yes, but also modernist sculptures that his father would have considered too radical. He also opened the Coach Barn, a massive building that housed his collection of antique carriages and early automobiles. The Coach Barn became a private museum, though only family and invited guests could view it. Junior's wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, was a passionate art collector. She co-founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York City in 1929. The couple filled Kykuit with paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts. Picassos hung in the hallways. Chinese porcelain-filled display cases. Persian rugs covered the floors. Kykuit became more than a mansion. It became a repository for one of the finest private art collections in America. Junior and Abby had 6 children, 5 sons and 1 daughter. Each son would receive a portion of the family fortune. Each would build his own career, and each would, in some way, remain connected to Kykuit. The most famous was Nelson Rockefeller. Born in 1908, Nelson was the second son. He grew up at Kykuit, playing in the gardens, exploring the estate's 3,400 acres. As an adult, he became governor of New York, serving from 1959 to 1973. Then he became vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford, serving from 1974 to 1977. Nelson inherited Kykuit after his father's death in 1960, and he transformed it. Nelson's passion was modern art. Between 1960 and his death in 1979, he added over 120 sculptures to the Kykuit gardens, works by Picasso, Calder, Moore, Nevelson, and David Smith. The gardens became an open-air museum of 20th-century sculpture. He also renovated the mansion's interior, adding a modern art gallery in the basement. The gallery held his personal collection, works by Ledger, Miro, and Warhol. Visiting Kykuit meant walking through a century of art history, from Renaissance bronzes in the gardens to pop art in the basement. But Nelson also understood something his grandfather had known. Privacy was power. Kykuit remained closed to the public during Nelson's lifetime. No tours, no photographs, no press access. If you visited Kykuit, it was because Nelson Rockefeller personally invited you. Presidents came, artists came, foreign diplomats came, but the general public never did. This was deliberate. The Rockefellers had learned from Carnegie's mistake. Carnegie built on Fifth Avenue, where everyone could see the mansion, where newspapers could photograph it, where the public could judge it. The Rockefellers built in Pocantico Hills behind walls and gates. What happened at Kykuit stayed at Kykuit. Nelson died in 1979 at age 70. The official cause was a heart attack. He died at his townhouse in Manhattan, not at Kykuit, though he'd spent nearly every summer of his life there. His death raised the question, what would happen to Kykuit now? The estate could have been sold. The art could have been auctioned. The land could have been subdivided and developed. This is what happened to almost every other Gilded Age estate. Economic pressures, inheritance taxes, and changing family priorities led to dissolution. But the Rockefellers had planned for this. In 1991, the family donated Kykuit to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. But, and this is critical, they donated it with conditions. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund would maintain the property. The family would retain control over access and use, and the estate would never be fully open to the general public. The National Trust agreed. Starting in 1994, limited tours were allowed, but you couldn't just show up. You had to make reservations months in advance through Historic Hudson Valley, the organization that managed visits. You were assigned to a specific tour time. You could only see the rooms and gardens the family permitted. You couldn't photograph the interior. You couldn't wander freely. Even in donation, the Rockefellers maintained control. Today, Kykuit still belongs to the National Trust. The Rockefeller family still has significant influence over its operation. Some areas of the estate remain completely off limits to tours. The family retains private access to certain buildings. This is the fundamental difference between Kykuit and Carnegie's mansion. Carnegie's palace died because it was vulnerable. Built on public Fifth Avenue. Owned by a widow who ran out of money, sold to a developer who saw only the land value. Demolished and replaced by apartment buildings. Kykuit survived because it was protected, hidden in Pocantico Hills, owned by a dynasty with inexhaustible wealth. Donated with conditions that preserve family control, maintained in perpetuity by trusts and foundations. Carnegie's mansion lasted 33 years. Kykuit has lasted 111 years and counting. The reason is simple. Generational wealth and total control. The Rockefellers understood that wealth means nothing if you don't protect it. That estates mean nothing if you allow them to be vulnerable to market forces or public pressure. So they built walls. They established trusts. They created foundations. They ensured that even after death, even after donation, even after the family no longer lived there full time, Kykuit would remain theirs. Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth, arguing that the rich should give away their fortunes. He did exactly that, and his mansion was destroyed. Rockefeller gave away even more than Carnegie in absolute dollars, but he gave strategically. He created institutions that bore his name. He established foundations that ensured his family's influence would continue. He donated Kykuit in a way that maintained control. One man gave away his wealth and lost everything. The other gave away his wealth and preserved everything. Today, if you want to see Carnegie's mansion, you can't. It doesn't exist. You can visit the site, 2 East 91st Street, and see 5 ordinary apartment buildings. There's no plaque, no memorial, no indication that anything significant ever stood there. If you want to see Kykuit, you can, sort of. You can make a reservation, pay the fee, take the tour, see the gardens, the sculpture collection, some of the rooms. But you'll see only what the Rockefellers allow you to see. And that's the legacy. Carnegie believed that fortunes should be given back to the people. Rockefeller believed that fortunes should be managed to maintain family power and influence across generations. Carnegie's mansion is gone. Rockefeller's mansion endures. Carnegie's name survives on libraries and universities he funded. Rockefeller's name survives on those things too, but it also survives on the estate in the family through institutions that still bear his name and operate under his principles. The Rockefellers won, not because they were more generous, not because they were better people, but because they understood that in America, wealth without control is temporary, and they refused to let go. Kykuit stands today as proof that dynasties can endure if they're willing to do what it takes to protect themselves, that mansions can survive if they're hidden behind enough walls, that even in death, even in philanthropy, even in apparent generosity, control can be maintained. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, but his estate remains, his family remains, his control remains. And the mansion he built, the oil palace no one was supposed to see, is still there, still guarded, still owned by the dynasty that refused to surrender it. Today, if you want to visit Kykuit, you can make a reservation through historic Hudson Valley. You'll pay $25 for admission. You'll be assigned to a guided tour. You'll see the gardens, the sculpture collection, and selected rooms of the mansion. But you won't see everything. The family archives remain closed. Certain wings of the house are off limits. The private family cemetery where John D. Rockefeller is buried is inaccessible to tours. Even in donation, even in public access, the Rockefellers maintained control. Compare this to Carnegie's mansion. You cannot visit it because it no longer exists. There are no tours, no archives, no rooms to see, just apartment buildings where working-class families live, the descendants of the steel workers whose labor built Carnegie's fortune. 2 men, 2 fortunes, 2 mansions, two completely different endings. Carnegie gave away $350 million and died, believing he'd redeemed his wealth. His mansion was demolished 16 years after his death. Today, nothing remains except the libraries he funded and the universities that bear his name. Rockefeller gave away $540 million and died knowing his dynasty would endure. His mansion still stands 111 years after completion. Today, you can walk the same gardens he walked, see the same views he saw, touch the same sculptures he collected. The difference wasn't generosity. Both men gave away massive fortunes. The difference was control. Carnegie built on Fifth Avenue where everyone could see. He wrote essays about the moral duty of wealth. He believed the rich owed society. He died, and his mansion became vulnerable. His widow sold it. A developer demolished it. History forgot it. Rockefeller built in Pocantico Hills where no one could see. He never wrote philosophical essays. He never explained himself. He simply built walls, established trusts, and ensured his family would never have to surrender what they'd built. Which approach was right? Carnegie believed fortunes should return to the people who created them. His workers built the steel. His workers should benefit through libraries and schools. His mansion, built on their suffering, deserved to be erased. Rockefeller believed fortunes should be managed across generations. His workers refined the oil. But the wealth belonged to him. His mansion, built on his success, deserved to be protected forever. One man saw wealth as temporary stewardship. The other saw it as permanent dynasty. Carnegie's name survives on 2,509 libraries. Rockefeller's name survives on Kykuit. Carnegie's philosophy died with his mansion. Rockefeller's dynasty continues through his descendants. The question is, which legacy is greater? If you ask the millions of people who've used Carnegie libraries over the past century, the answer is obvious. Carnegie's philanthropy touched more lives, educated more children, and created more opportunity than any mansion ever could. But if you visit Kykuit and walk through gardens filled with masterpieces, if you stand where Nelson Rockefeller stood when he was vice president, if you see a family's century of wealth preserved in stone and sculpture and perfectly manicured terraces, you understand something Carnegie never achieved: permanence. Carnegie built for his lifetime. Rockefeller built for all time. Carnegie tried to give everything away. Rockefeller gave strategically, maintaining control even in generosity. Carnegie's mansion vanished. Rockefeller's mansion endures. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Gilded Age. The fortunes built on oil and steel were always going to face judgment. The Homestead strike and the Standard Oil monopoly were always going to stain the legacies. But Carnegie accepted that judgment. He gave away his fortune. He let his mansion fall. He believed redemption came through surrender. Rockefeller rejected judgment entirely. He built walls. He controlled access. He made sure history could never erase what he'd built because history was never allowed close enough to try. Today, Kykuit stands as proof that dynasties can endure if they're willing to do what it takes. That wealth, if properly protected, can last forever. That even philanthropic donations can be structured to maintain family power. The oil palace no one was supposed to see is still hidden behind gates, still controlled by the family that built it, still closed to anyone who doesn't have permission. Carnegie's mansion became apartments for workers. Rockefeller's mansion became a museum for the elite. One ending was justice, the other was victory, Des, and the Rockefellers won.